Councilman Richard Hargrove was a man who thrived on attention. With his perfectly tailored suits, polished shoes, and an air of superiority that made him seem untouchable, he commanded every room he entered. People either admired him for his confidence or despised him for his arrogance. It depended on whom you asked. But one thing everyone agreed on was this: Richard Hargrove didn't play by anyone else's rules. On a chilly autumn evening, Hargrove found himself driving home after attending yet another glamorous fundraising gala. The event had been filled with wealthy donors eager to shower him with praise and money for his upcoming re-election campaign. As he cruised down the highway, feeling invincible behind the wheel of his luxury sedan, he barely noticed the speedometer creeping past the legal limit. After all, why should someone like him worry about trivial things like traffic laws? But fate has a way of intervening when people least expect it. A pair of flashing blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror. For a moment, Hargrove hesitated, debating whether to ignore them entirely. Who would dare pull him over? He was a councilman, a pillar of the community. Surely no officer would waste their time ticketing someone as important as him. Reluctantly, he slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder, muttering under his breath about how inconvenient this was. As he waited, tapping his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel, he saw the silhouette of a figure approaching his car. It was Officer Marcus Johnson, a seasoned police officer known for his calm demeanor and unwavering professionalism. Dressed in full uniform, flashlight in hand, Officer Johnson approached the vehicle with the kind of authority that demanded respect. "Good evening, sir," Officer Johnson said politely as he leaned down to peer into the window. "Do you know why I stopped you tonight?" Hargrove rolled down his window just enough to glare at the officer through the narrow opening. His eyes narrowed further when he realized the person addressing him was black. In his mind, someone like Officer Johnson shouldn't have the audacity to question someone of his stature. "This better be quick," Hargrove snapped, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm a very busy man." Officer Johnson remained unfazed. "Sir, I clocked you going 15 miles over the speed limit. May I see your license and registration, please?" The request seemed absurd to Hargrove. Why should he, a respected public figure, be subjected to such indignity? Didn't this officer know who he was talking to? Instead of complying immediately, Hargrove began lecturing the officer about respecting authority and understanding priorities. Each word dripped with disdain, but Officer Johnson simply stood there, patient and composed, waiting for the documents he'd requested. What Hargrove failed to realize was that his behavior wasn't just rude. It was setting off alarm bells in Officer Johnson's mind. This wasn't the first time the officer had encountered entitled individuals who thought they were above the law. But something about Hargrove felt different, more toxic. Little did Hargrove know, his actions were about to spiral far beyond a simple traffic stop. Karma, silent but ever-present, was already preparing its response. Hargrove's patience, or lack thereof, was wearing thin. The longer Officer Johnson stood there, the more agitated he became. To him, this wasn't just a routine traffic stop. It was an affront to his status, a challenge to the invisible hierarchy he believed existed in the world. In his mind, someone like Officer Johnson should have been grateful for the mere opportunity to interact with a man of his importance. Instead, here was this officer, calmly insisting on following protocol as if Hargrove were just another ordinary citizen. "Listen here," Hargrove finally spat out, leaning closer to the partially rolled down window. His voice carried an edge that made even the cool autumn air feel heavier. "You need to understand something. People like me don't have time for nonsense from, well, people like you." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. "Officer." Johnson didn't flinch, but the subtle tightening of his jaw suggested he understood exactly what Hargrove was implying. It wasn't the first time he'd faced disrespect on the job, but there was something particularly venomous about the way Hargrove delivered his insult. The councilman wasn't just annoyed. He was trying to assert dominance, to remind Officer Johnson of his place in a system skewed by prejudice. "I'm just doing my job, sir," Officer Johnson replied evenly, refusing to rise to the bait. "License and registration, please," But Hargrove wasn't done. He leaned back in his seat, sneering now, his tone dripping with mockery. "Oh, I see how it is. You think you're better than everyone else because you wear that badge? Let me tell you something, boy. You wouldn't last 5 minutes without people like me keeping this city running." The word boy struck like a slap across the face. It was deliberate, calculated, a reminder of a painful history meant to demean and diminish. Officer Johnson felt it deeply, not just as a personal attack but as a reflection of the systemic racism he'd faced throughout his career. For a brief moment, anger flickered inside him, hot and immediate. But years of training and discipline kicked in, forcing him to push those emotions aside. Instead of retaliating, Officer Johnson took a deep breath. "Sir," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing within him. "If you could provide your license and registration, we can resolve this quickly." Hargrove scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. Fine, he muttered, rummaging through his glove compartment with exaggerated irritation. When he finally handed over the documents, he did so carelessly, almost throwing them at Officer Johnson. "Here, happy now?" Officer Johnson accepted the papers without comment, his professionalism unwavering. As he walked back to his patrol car to process the ticket, he couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of the situation. Here was a man who claimed to represent the public yet treated others with such blatant contempt. And while Hargrove might have thought he'd won some sort of moral victory by asserting his superiority, Officer Johnson knew better. Actions like these always had consequences, even if they weren't immediately visible. What neither man realized, however, was that their encounter hadn't gone unnoticed. A local news crew covering a story about road safety nearby had inadvertently captured the entire exchange on camera. Their equipment picked up every word, every dismissive gesture, and every ounce of tension between the two men. By the time Officer Johnson returned to deliver the speeding ticket, the footage was already being reviewed and edited for broadcast. As Hargrove snatched the ticket from Officer Johnson's hand, muttering under his breath about wasting taxpayer dollars, karma began its quiet work. The seeds of accountability had been planted, and soon enough they would sprout into something neither man could ignore. As Officer Johnson returned to his patrol car, the night seemed calm and uneventful. Just another routine traffic stop in a long line of many. But unbeknownst to both men, their interaction had been caught on camera by a local news crew stationed less than 50 feet away. The journalists hadn't intended to film anything related to Hargrove. They were there to cover an unrelated story about road safety initiatives. However, when they noticed the councilman's luxury sedan pulled over, curiosity got the better of them. They zoomed in with their camera, capturing every detail of the tense exchange. The footage was damning. From Hargrove's dismissive body language to his condescending tone, it painted a picture of a man who believed himself untouchable. When he leaned toward the window and sneered the word, "boy," the audio picked it up clearly. A single word, loaded with centuries of painful history. Even without context, anyone watching could feel the weight of the insult. And then there was Officer Johnson, calm, composed, and professional, despite the blatant disrespect hurled his way. His quiet dignity stood in stark contrast to Hargrove's arrogance, making the power dynamics painfully obvious. Back at the station, the news crew reviewed the raw footage late into the night. At first, they debated whether to use it. After all, this wasn't the story they'd set out to cover. But as they watched the clip again and again, they realized its significance. This wasn't just about a speeding ticket. It was about accountability, respect, and the deep-rooted prejudices that still lingered in society. By morning, the decision was made. They would air the segment during the 6 a.m. broadcast. By breakfast, time the video had gone viral. Social media platforms buzzed with outrage as people shared clips of Hargrove's behavior. Comments poured in from across the country, condemning his actions and praising Officer Johnson for his restraint. Hashtags like "Respect Authority" and "Justice for Marcus" began trending nationwide. Local activists quickly organized protests outside City Hall, demanding consequences for Hargrove's behavior. What started as a quiet highway confrontation had, exploded into a national conversation about racism and privilege. Meanwhile, Hargrove remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. He spent the night stewing over the ticket, convinced that Officer Johnson had somehow wronged him by enforcing the law. As far as he was concerned, the matter was closed. He went to bed believing he'd won the upper hand, dismissing the entire incident as a minor inconvenience. The next morning, however, reality hit hard. Reporters swarmed outside his house, microphones thrust forward, cameras rolling. Neighbors whispered behind fences, pointing fingers at the man who had once strutted through their streets like a king. Calls flooded his phone, from colleagues, constituents, even friends, all asking for explanations or distancing themselves entirely. For the first time in years, Hargrove felt vulnerable, exposed. The invincible facade he'd built crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. Officer Johnson, on the other hand, woke up to messages of support flooding his inbox. Friends, family, and strangers alike praised him for handling the situation with grace and professionalism. Community leaders reached out, inviting him to speak at upcoming events to discuss issues of racial bias and policing. While Hargrove faced mounting criticism, Johnson became a symbol of resilience. An ordinary man thrust into extraordinary circumstances who refused to let hatred shake his foundation. What neither man fully grasped yet was how much this moment would change their lives forever. For Hargrove, karma was only beginning its work. For Johnson, the spotlight offered not just challenges but opportunities to inspire others, to spark change, and to remind the world that true strength lies in staying grounded when everything else feels chaotic. The fallout from the viral video hit Councilman Richard Hargrove like a freight train. By mid-morning, what had started as whispers among neighbors turned into a deafening roar of public outrage. Social media was ablaze with screenshots, memes, and commentary dissecting every second of his interaction with Officer Marcus Johnson. The hashtag #RespectAuthority trended not just locally but nationally, drawing attention from news outlets across the country. Protesters gathered outside City Hall, holding signs that read, "No room for racism" and "Accountability now." First, Hargrove tried to downplay the incident. He released a carefully worded statement claiming he'd been misquoted and accusing the news crew of editing the footage to make him look bad. But the raw audio left no room for doubt. His words were plain as day. Even some of his closest political allies began distancing themselves, issuing lukewarm statements about how they didn't condone disrespectful behavior or calling for further investigation. One by one, endorsements dried up, campaign donations slowed to a trickle, and invitations to high-profile events disappeared. Meanwhile, Officer Johnson became an unexpected hero. His calm demeanor in the face of blatant disrespect resonated deeply with people who saw him as a symbol of resilience. Local leaders invited him to speak at community forums, schools, and town halls. People praised him not only for his professionalism, but also for representing dignity in the face of adversity. For many, he embodied the kind of leadership they wished to see more of, not just in law enforcement but in society as a whole. But karma wasn't done with Hargrove yet. As the scandal grew, anonymous tips began pouring in to investigative journalists and government watchdogs. It didn't take long for skeletons to tumble out of Hargrove's closet. Former staffers came forward alleging discriminatory practices within his office. Employees recounted instances where he openly mocked minority colleagues, made racially insensitive jokes, and even excluded qualified candidates from promotions based on their ethnicity. These accounts added fuel to the fire, painting a picture of a man whose prejudices weren't isolated incidents but part of a pattern. Then came the bombshell: evidence of financial misconduct. Investigators uncovered documents showing that Hargrove had been siphoning campaign funds for personal use. Luxury vacations, expensive dinners, and lavish gifts, all paid for with money meant to support his re-election efforts. Anonymous sources revealed that this had been going on for years, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and trusted aides willing to turn a blind eye. When reporters confronted Hargrove with these allegations, he stammered and stumbled, unable to offer a coherent defense. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Calls for his resignation grew louder, echoing through protests and petitions signed by thousands. Even members of his own party urged him to step down, fearing the scandal would tarnish their reputation heading into the next election cycle. Hargrove, once so confident in his untouchable status, found himself cornered. His arrogance had blinded him to the consequences of his actions, and now it was too late to undo the damage. For Officer Johnson, life took a different turn. While Hargrove faced mounting scrutiny, Johnson received overwhelming support from the community. Strangers stopped him in grocery stores to thank him for setting an example. Parents told their children stories about how he handled the situation with grace under pressure. Community organizations awarded him certificates of appreciation, and local businesses offered discounts and free meals as gestures of gratitude. Despite the newfound attention, Johnson remained humble, often reminding people that he was simply doing his job. What struck everyone most was the stark contrast between the two men. On one side stood Hargrove, a man undone by his own hubris, facing ruin both professionally and personally. On the other stood Johnson, a man lifted by his integrity, inspiring hope and change in a fractured community. The juxtaposition was impossible to ignore, serving as a powerful reminder that actions have consequences. Karma, silent but inevitable, had begun its work, and it showed no signs of stopping anytime soon. As the scandal surrounding Councilman Richard Hargrove intensified, it felt like a storm cloud had settled over his life. The once untouchable politician was now drowning in a sea of accusations, investigations, and public outrage. Every new revelation chipped away at his crumbling facade, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. What started as a single viral video had spiraled into a full-blown reckoning, one that threatened to consume everything he had worked for. The allegations of embezzlement were particularly damning. Investigators revealed that Hargrove had been siphoning campaign funds for years using taxpayer money meant for community projects to fund his extravagant lifestyle. Luxury vacations to exotic destinations, designer suits, expensive dinners at high-end restaurants, all paid for with ill-gotten gains. When reporters dug deeper, they uncovered canceled checks, bank statements, and emails linking Hargrove directly to the fraudulent transactions. It became clear that this wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a pattern of greed and entitlement. But the financial misconduct was only part of the story. Former staffers continued coming forward, sharing stories about Hargrove's discriminatory behavior behind closed doors. One aide recounted how he openly mocked minority colleagues during meetings, making derogatory comments about their names or cultural backgrounds. Another described how he routinely sidelined qualified candidates for promotions if they didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptable. These accounts painted a picture of a man who not only abused his power, but also fostered a toxic work environment rooted in prejudice. Meanwhile, Officer Marcus Johnson found himself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. His calm professionalism during the traffic stop had resonated deeply with people across the country, turning him into a symbol of resilience and integrity. Community leaders invited him to speak at events, eager to highlight his commitment to fairness and equality. Schools asked him to address students, hoping to inspire young minds with his story of grace under pressure. Even strangers approached him on the street, thanking him for being a role model in a time when such figures felt rare. Despite the attention, Johnson remained grounded. He often reminded people that he was simply doing his job, that any officer worth their badge would have acted the same way. But deep down, he knew the significance of what had happened. This wasn't just about one man's downfall. It was about challenging systemic biases and holding those in power accountable. For Johnson, the moment represented an opportunity, a chance to spark meaningful conversations about race, respect, and justice. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been starker. While Hargrove scrambled to salvage his career, issuing desperate apologies and blaming others for his mistakes, Johnson stood tall, embodying quiet strength and humility. Where Hargrove's actions screamed arrogance and self-interest, Johnson's reflected patience and principle. People couldn't help but notice the difference, and they responded accordingly. Support for Hargrove evaporated overnight, while admiration for Johnson soared. By the end of the week, the city council held an emergency meeting to discuss Hargrove's future. Facing mounting pressure from constituents, colleagues, and even national leaders, many members called for his immediate removal from office. Hargrove, sensing the walls closing in, submitted his resignation in a terse letter released late at night. In it, he claimed he was stepping aside to focus on personal matters, though few believed the thinly veiled excuse. The council accepted his resignation without ceremony, marking the official end of his political career. For Hargrove, the fall from grace was swift and brutal. Once celebrated as a pillar of the community, he now faced charges of corruption and hate speech. Violations, legal fees piled up, friendships dissolved, and his name became synonymous with hypocrisy and prejudice. As he sat alone in his home, watching news reports about Officer Johnson's growing influence, a flicker of guilt began to creep in, but it was too little, too late. Karma, patient yet relentless, had delivered its verdict. And while Hargrove's world crumbled around him, Officer Johnson emerged stronger than ever, proving that true character shines brightest in moments of adversity. The legal proceedings against Richard Hargrove moved quickly, almost as if the universe itself was eager to see justice served. Within weeks of his resignation, charges were formally filed against him, not just for embezzlement but also for hate speech violations stemming from the viral traffic stop incident. The courtroom became a stage where his downfall played out, in full view of the public. Reporters packed the benches, cameras clicked incessantly, and citizens lined up outside hoping to catch a glimpse of the disgraced politician. Hargrove's defense team tried every trick in the book to paint him as a victim of circumstance or media exaggeration. They argued that the video didn't capture the full context of his interaction with Officer Marcus Johnson, and claimed the financial misconduct allegations were based on misunderstandings. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, emails, and testimonies from former staffers left no room for doubt. Even Hargrove's own words during the traffic stop, preserved in crystal-clear audio, spoke volumes about his prejudices and arrogance. During one particularly tense moment in court, a former aide took the stand. She recounted how Hargrove had once referred to minority staff members as tokens behind closed doors, mocking their contributions and dismissing their concerns. Her testimony visibly rattled him. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For someone who had always prided himself on control and authority, this loss of power must have felt unbearable. While Hargrove faced judgment inside the courthouse, Officer Johnson continued to shine outside it. The police department promoted him to a leadership role focused on community relations, a position created specifically to address issues of bias and trust between law enforcement and marginalized groups. It was a fitting recognition of his dedication to fairness and service. In interviews, Johnson emphasized the importance of building bridges rather than walls, urging people to focus on unity instead of division. Community leaders rallied around him, organizing events where he could share his experiences and insights. At one such gathering, held in a packed auditorium, Johnson spoke candidly about the challenges of being a black officer in a system often marred by inequality. "I'm not special because I stayed calm during that traffic stop," he said humbly. "I'm just someone who believes in doing what's right, even when it's hard." His words earned a standing ovation, leaving many in tears. As Hargrove awaited sentencing, his life unraveled further. Friends he thought loyal stopped returning. His calls. Luxury brands revoked sponsorships they'd quietly offered him in better days. His name became synonymous with corruption and prejudice, splashed across headlines alongside phrases like "fall from grace" and "reckoning overdue." Once accustomed to luxury and privilege, he now spent sleepless nights wondering how far he would fall and whether anyone would care enough to help him pick up the pieces. Finally, the judge delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts. Hargrove was sentenced to several years in prison for embezzlement and fined heavily for his discriminatory behavior. As bailiffs led him away in handcuffs, cameras captured his defeated expression, a stark contrast to the smug confidence he'd displayed during the traffic stop. Justice had been served, not just legally but symbolically. A man who had spent years exploiting others for personal gain was finally held accountable. For Officer Johnson, the case marked a turning point, not just professionally, but personally. He knew the attention wouldn't last forever, and that was okay. What mattered most was the impact he could make while people were listening. Whether speaking at schools, mentoring young officers, or working directly with communities, he carried himself with the same dignity and humility that had earned him admiration in the first place. By the time the dust settled, the city felt different. Conversations about race, accountability, and systemic change dominated local discourse. Statues honoring historical figures tied to racism were removed, replaced by tributes to modern-day heroes like Johnson. Policies aimed at increasing transparency and equity within law enforcement gained traction, thanks in part to his advocacy. And though Hargrove's name lingered in infamy, it served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that no amount of wealth or influence can shield someone from the consequences of their actions. Karma, patient yet inevitable, had struck decisively. While Hargrove faced the ruins of his choices, Officer Johnson stood tall, embodying hope, resilience, and the enduring power of integrity. Months after the whirlwind of scandals, trials, and public outrage subsided, Richard Hargrove found himself living a life he barely recognized. Once accustomed to luxury penthouses, chauffeured cars, and dinners at five-star restaurants, he now resided in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, a far cry from his former glory. The walls were bare, the furniture secondhand, and the silence inside deafening. Gone were the days when aides bustled around him or reporters sought his opinion. Now he spent most of his time alone, staring out the window at a world that had moved on without him. Hargrove's fall from grace wasn't just financial, it was deeply personal. Friends who once laughed at his jokes and nodded along with his opinions now crossed the street to avoid him. Family members distanced themselves, embarrassed by association. Even his own children stopped visiting, unable to reconcile the man they loved with the public figure exposed as corrupt and prejudiced. Loneliness gnawed at him day and night, leaving him restless and bitter. He replayed moments from his past over and over in his mind, wondering where it all went wrong. One evening, while flipping through television channels, Hargrove stumbled upon an interview featuring Officer Marcus Johnson. Dressed in his uniform, Johnson sat confidently beside a community leader, discussing initiatives aimed at fostering trust between law enforcement and minority groups. His calm demeanor and thoughtful responses captivated the audience, earning applause from the studio crowd. Watching this, Hargrove felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, jealousy, but also something deeper: guilt. For weeks, that feeling lingered, growing stronger each time he saw Johnson's name in the news or heard praise for his work. It wasn't just guilt over what he'd said during the traffic stop. It was shame for the years of discriminatory behavior and exploitation he'd tried so hard to bury. Late one night, sitting alone at his kitchen table, Hargrove decided to write a letter. At first, the words came haltingly, awkward, and defensive. But as he poured his thoughts onto paper, something shifted. For the first time, he allowed himself to confront the truth, not just about his actions, but about the harm they caused. "Officer Johnson," the letter began, "I owe you an apology. What I said to you that night was wrong, disrespectful, and rooted in prejudice I should have addressed long ago. No excuse can justify my behavior, and no amount of regret will undo the damage I've done. You handled yourself with dignity and professionalism, qualities I lacked entirely." He went on to acknowledge the broader impact of his actions, admitting that his prejudices likely hurt others beyond those directly involved. "I let power blind me," he wrote. "I used my position not to serve but to dominate, and in doing so, I betrayed the very people I claimed to represent. I hope someday to make amends, not because I expect forgiveness, but because I know I must try." When the letter was finished, Hargrove hesitated before sealing it in an envelope. Sending it wouldn't erase his mistakes or restore his reputation. But it felt like a start, a small step toward redemption. Whether Johnson would read it or respond didn't matter. What mattered was taking responsibility, even if belatedly. Meanwhile, Johnson received the letter a few days later. Reading it, he felt a mixture of surprise and contemplation. While skeptical of its sincerity given its timing, he appreciated the effort. Redemption, he knew, was a long road, one paved with consistent action rather than empty words. Still, he hoped this marked the beginning of Hargrove's journey toward self-awareness, however late it might be. As weeks turned into months, Hargrove continued grappling with his failures. He volunteered at local shelters, attended anti-bias workshops, and slowly rebuilt fragments of his shattered life. Though many doubted his transformation, some cautiously welcomed his efforts. For Johnson, life carried on much as before, focused on service, community, and progress. Both men walked separate paths, shaped indelibly by their shared encounter. Karma had struck swiftly, but healing took time and humility. The city had changed. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but the ripple effects of that fateful traffic stop continued to shape its people and policies in profound ways. Officer Marcus Johnson became more than just a name. He became a symbol of resilience, dignity, and hope. Streets once marked by division now buzzed with conversations about unity and reform. Schools introduced programs teaching students about systemic bias and the importance of standing up for justice. Community centers hosted workshops where residents could openly discuss their experiences with prejudice and work together toward solutions. For Johnson, life settled into a rhythm of purpose. His promotion within the police department gave him a platform to advocate for meaningful change. He spearheaded initiatives aimed at improving relations between law enforcement and marginalized communities, emphasizing transparency, accountability, and empathy. Under his leadership, officers underwent mandatory training on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation tactics. Slowly but surely, trust began to rebuild, a fragile yet hopeful foundation for the future. Statues honoring historical figures tied to racism were replaced with monuments celebrating modern-day heroes like Johnson. A local artist created a mural depicting him standing tall against a backdrop of diverse faces, symbolizing strength through unity. The artwork quickly became a landmark, drawing visitors who wanted to pay tribute or simply reflect on the progress made and the work still needed. Meanwhile, Richard Hargrove's attempts at redemption remained a topic of quiet debate. Some dismissed his efforts as too little, too late, while others cautiously acknowledged his willingness to confront his mistakes. Volunteering at shelters and attending anti-bias workshops didn't erase his past actions, but it showed a glimmer of growth, a man trying, however imperfectly, to make amends. Though many doubted his sincerity, some believed even flawed redemption was better than none at all. Years later, during a community event celebrating equality and progress, Johnson delivered a speech that resonated deeply with everyone present. Standing before a crowd of hundreds, he spoke not just about the challenges they'd overcome, but also about the ones ahead. "Change isn't easy," he said, his voice steady and warm. "It requires courage, patience, and persistence. But every step forward matters, whether it's calling out injustice when we see it or simply treating one another with respect." As he concluded, Johnson paused and looked out at the sea of faces. Among them sat Richard Hargrove, now older, and visibly humbled. Their eyes met briefly, and though no words passed between them, there was an unspoken understanding. This moment belonged not to either of them individually, but to the collective journey of a city striving to be better. That night, as fireworks lit up the sky to celebrate how far they'd come, the contrast between the two men couldn't have been clearer. One had risen from adversity, inspiring countless others along the way. The other had fallen hard, only to claw his way back toward humanity. Both stories served as reminders of the power of choices, the good, the bad, and the redemptive. In the end, karma hadn't just punished Hargrove. It had taught him a lesson. And it hadn't just rewarded Johnson. It had amplified his ability to inspire. Together, their intertwined journeys became a testament to the enduring truth that actions always carry consequences. And true character is revealed not in moments of triumph, but in how we respond to failure. The city moved forward, forever shaped by what had happened. Its scars remained, but so did its resilience. For Officer Marcus Johnson, the road ahead was bright with promise. For Richard Hargrove, it was uncertain but tinged with hope. And for everyone else, it was a reminder that change begins with accountability and grows with compassion.